Hey guys, Connor with you with the World Divide. Today I want to talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I want to about it from the time frame of kind of when the Civil War started, right after the coup back in 2014, all the way till recently, kind of ending at the end of the month of September. And I'll be giving more like daily updates, kind of day by day, on things that have been kind of developing throughout the month of October. Although recently things have been relatively quiet, kind of like a calm before a storm type situation. But we'll get to that in another video. What I want to talk about is kind of how things have developed to this point and kind of my general thoughts about how things have developed up until recently. And I'm going to give a relatively general overview. I don't have some of my resources that I usually do in front of me, like some of the maps and things like that. My laptop's currently being repaired. Um, so some references, specific examples and references that I'll want to give, I won't have the names for them conjured up in my brain as much as I want them to be. So anyways, without further ado, let's get started. So back in 2014, before the coup even happened, there was a pro-Russian government within Ukraine. Um, there were a lot of kind of, Russian authorities within the government. There was a lot of bonds between the Russians and the Ukrainians. They're very similar people. I mean, Russia as a state itself was born from Kiev. The idea of Russia came from Kiev. And the first iteration of the Russian state was called Kievan Rus. And this is before the great expansion, kind of to the east, when you had some of your later czars that discovered or or knew inherently the geographical weaknesses of Russia as a state, which stemmed um, largely or most importantly from the European plain that starts as kind of a bottleneck in eastern Germany and expands out almost like a funnel for the further and further east you go, to the point where by the time you get to modern Russia's borders, they have to defend 2,000 over 2,000 kilometers of border with very little geographical barriers, very flat, open, easy to traverse. And this is what you saw with the Germans in World War II. They took advantage of this, and they were able to use the European plain to advance very quickly upon Russia and or the Soviet Union at the time. And they did what they used the strategy that they knew best. They threw bodies at the battle, lots and lots of bodies. Um, the Germans, in particular, were defeated at a place called Stalingrad, now known as Volgograd. Um, and the reason the Germans were pushing very hard in this direction was because where Volgograd is currently is just north of the Caucasus. It is like a somewhat narrow piece of Russian territory connecting currently from Ukraine all the way to Kazakhstan. And if a power were to able to gain control of this gap, they were able to have a presence there. They would basically cut off Russia from some of its most profitable oil-producing regions, as well as the Black Sea, the Caucasus, and the Caspian Sea, all at once. A move like this would absolutely cripple the Russian economy. Um, and that's something that I think in modern times that a lot of military strategists definitely think about in some of the Western powers. Um, but anyways, moving on to 2014, knowing this. There was a coup that took place in Ukraine that was Western backed, NATO backed, the goal of which was to install a kind of a more democratic thinking government into power. Um, and this is how, leaders like Vladimir Zelensky ended up being kind of born out of this. Um, and what happened then was there was large parts of the population that didn't approve of what ended up happening, that coup. They didn't approve of the new government that was in place. So what you ended up having was a civil war. And basically the remnants of kind of that previous pro-Russian government ended up being relegated to the regions of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic in an eastern region in Ukraine called the Donbass, which is kind of their industrial powerhouse. That region, it's a lot less flat than most regions in Ukraine. It's a bit more hilly. There's a bit more like of industrial complexes going on. A lot of Soviet architecture there. And of course all throughout Ukraine, but especially in the Donbass. But most importantly, in the Donbass, you have majority ethnic Russian population there, and then in the southern regions, where the Russians also currently control, you have Russian speaking majority there, with a Russian ethnic minority in the southern regions. So that was the situation in 2014. You had the DPR and the LPR facing off against the new Ukrainian government. In 2015, the Ukrainians attempted to finish the civil war by basically surrounding Donetsk city. They were nearly successful, and the reasons for their failure was because of Russian involvement. They wanted to prevent Ukraine from basically encircling Donetsk city, and they were successful. It was one of the biggest, I'd say, military defeats for Ukraine, even including up until now with this current conflict. So it remained like that for quite a long time. There's quite a stalemate. The borders between the DPR, LPR, and Ukraine itself became more and more fortified over the years. The borders between Donetsk city and the rest of Ukraine ended up becoming the most fortified positions pretty much in the entire world. And of course, on the Ukrainian side, you have 4 strongholds along that line of contact. You have Marinka, you have Pishki, Krasnogorovka, and the strongest stronghold being Avdiivka. So the conflict ended up being relegated to that area for quite a long time. It was also around that time, too, during the chaos, that Russia ended up moving into Crimea. It's a peninsula inside the Black Sea that basically kind of juts out. It's mostly disconnected from mainland Ukraine, apart from very narrow strips of land. So it's very easy to fortify, but where it's located in the Black Sea as well allows you pretty much direct control and surveillance of everything that's going on inside the Black Sea. It's been, throughout history, one of the most important pieces of land to occupy and control. The Turks, the Russians have fought over it for thousands of years. The Russians moved in, they created a not sham referendum. That's to be debated, but I mean, what ended up happening was Crimea ended up voting to become part of Russia, and Ukraine never formally recognized this. So for the next 8 years, it ended up being kind of a relatively frozen conflict. There were some escalatory measures. Barack Obama in the United States never really did anything about it. He wanted to kind of push for like sanctions, but none of the other NATO member states were really that enthusiastic about it. When the Donald Trump presidency came about, he took a step that Barack Obama was not willing to take, which was to approve weapon transfers to Ukraine and to start pretty much helping the Ukrainian government finish the civil war. So we started to kind of escalate the situation further and further throughout the years, and then at one point, Russia pretty much had enough. They felt like there was an existential threat to their country if this civil war was run by the current Ukrainian government in power. So in February of 2022, they had amassed more than 200,000 troops along the entire Ukrainian border, as well as they had forces in Belarus. And so February 28th of 2022, Vladimir Putin made an announcement of the special military operation and pretty much started a full-scale invasion of Ukraine on all directions, pretty much 3 different directions, from the north, from Belarus, and aiming for Kiev, Chernihiv, and Sumy, from the east to hit Kharkiv, to take Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, from the south to take Zaporozhye, to take Kherson, Mariupol, to eventually expand out west into Mykolaiv and Odessa along the southern coastline. And I believe the goal at that time was to basically ideally take Kiev and force a new government into power, but really to force Kiev to the negotiating table to set better terms for Russia, so that way they could achieve some kind of peace agreement and not continue this war in the future. So the first phase of the war was definitely the type of strategy that the Russians pursued was more of like a blitzkrieg strategy. They wanted to finish the war in like 3 days. They had a great plan to go about doing this, but there was one mistake that the Russians made, and they basically misjudged the situation. They misjudged the Ukrainians' will to fight. They misjudged how the West would respond. I don't believe the Russians expected the West to basically combine their resources and to start supporting Ukraine en masse with weapon transfers, money, military training, etc. And to start the sanctions war that we're currently kind of facing now, where Russia and the collective West are both kind of in a state of an economic war of attrition. So that's kind of where this all started. And this plan to basically overthrow Kiev, if that was the plan, did not succeed. Russian forces ended up overextending their supply lines. They ended up not setting up very strong logistics. Supply trucks carrying ammunition, weapons, food ended up being great targets. Those supply trucks carried fuel that powered Russian equipment, armored vehicles, and the Ukrainians took very good advantage of that. And what the Ukrainians did very smartly was let Russia penetrate very deep into their territory. And then, with those overstretched supply lines, start targeting basically all the logistics of the Russian military. And so that's a strategy that Ukraine pursued during the first phase of the military operation. Um, in March of 2022, March leading into April, um, this was at a point when both leaders of Ukraine and Russia were willing to come together to start some sort of peace agreement, to start talking about ways to end this conflict, what concessions could Ukraine make, and what could Ukraine do that would basically satisfy Russia and make them believe that they're not a threat to the Russian state. And an agreement was made with Istanbul, Astana in Turkey. No, it was Istanbul. Mixing up my cities here. President Erdogan of Turkey ended up being the mediator between the two sides, and a peace agreement was made. And the contents of this agreement were that Ukraine would remain completely neutral. They would not they would not token their ideas kind of to the West. They would not pursue a path to join the European Union or NATO. They would recognize the independence of the Donbass regions, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, and they would also recognize Crimea as a part of the Russian Federation. And this was going to be the deal. And it was a good deal. Zelensky actually approved of it. He wanted to go through with it. It seems like both sides were aiming to actually find some sort of peace solution here. What happened then was that Russia pulled out of the Kiev, Chernihiv, and Sumy regions, alleviating pressure from Ukraine's capital. What happened next was Boris Johnson, the current Prime Minister of Britain, ended up traveling to Kiev and advising that Vladimir Zelensky continue with the war, to not go through with the peace agreement, and in exchange, the West would provide Ukraine with arms. They would train their troops. They would provide them with intelligence. They would give them everything they need, all the tools that they need to win this war. And at that point, Vladimir Zelensky threw away the peace deal and decided he was in a better strategic position to continue the war, with pressure being alleviated off of Kiev, to continue it. So it was this point that we entered the next phase of the operation, running from April all the way, kind of, I would say, until August, with this war of attrition, basically a phase of the war where little to no movements were made. It was square meter by square meter of kind of Russian artillery bombardment, and the Russian military's goal was basically just to target and reduce Ukraine's military capabilities while focusing their efforts on the Donbass, trying to complete the capture of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic. And at that stage of the war, Russia had already achieved one of its objectives, which was to establish a land bridge connecting Crimea with the rest of mainland Russia by taking control of the Kherson region and the Zaporozhye region, and with the near completion of the capture of Mariupol. Once they had captured Mariupol, after many months of fighting and nearly pretty much ruining the city, Russia achieved these objectives. They were able to create that land bridge. And now their goals were very clear: take the Donbass, and reduce the Ukrainian military to where they're not a threat to Russia, and they can kind of force them to a negotiated settlement, a peace agreement. So it went on like this for a while. Russia ended up getting involved with the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk operation, where they made a breakthrough in a small town of Popasna they'd been working on for months. When they took Popasna, they had penetrated behind Ukrainian lines. They were able to create a flower from that, basically um, starting offensives from multiple different directions, which allowed them to collapse the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk um, area and complete control of the Luhansk People's Republic. And this took place around June, July. Um, from there, around this time, Ukraine had been mobilizing. They had been gathering more and more forces. They had accumulated to what Ukraine had said right around late July, early August, to be in a 1,000,000-man army. And this was around the time, so Russia had probably around 350,000 personnel in Ukraine, including, like, you know, folks on your front lines, reconnaissance, artillery, brigades, you know, the all the military personnel and equipment behind the scenes. Um, and right around August, um, a lot of the contracts for a lot of the troops that were in Ukraine had expired. Um, and even before this war started, a lot of contracts for some of these troops were already kind of going up. And what Russia did was extend the contracts for another 6 months so they could take part in this operation. And so what you saw in August was a huge reduction in troops that were stationed in Ukraine on the Russian side. And this presented a very nice opportunity for Ukraine to start kind of counteroffensive operations. Russia had just been involved kind of in this war of attrition for a long period of time, making very small gains, minute gains, but just slowly dissecting and pulling apart the Ukrainian military and logistics capabilities. So what you had next, after a lot of Russian troops had left Ukraine, after the West had been escalating slowly throughout the war, the amount of equipment, the types of equipment that they would send to Ukraine. One particular piece of equipment that made quite a large difference was the HIMARS, multiple rocket system that the United States provided. Very accurate, long-range ballistic missiles that ended up forcing Russia to reorganize its logistical capabilities to distribute their ammo depots, their warehouses, into smaller locations, spread out a lot more. So both sides had to kind of work to reorganize in order to better optimize themselves in this war. But when troop reduction happened in August, this gave Ukraine an opportunity to start counteroffensive operations. It forced Russia into a more defensive posture. It was at this point that a lot of Russian nationalists, kind of war enthusiasts within Russia, were starting to become louder and louder, complain a lot more that Vladimir Putin was not doing enough in the special military operation, and that the calling this a special military operation provided a lot of restraints to the Russian military, that they were not able to enact a lot of their capabilities in Ukraine. So what ended up happening next was you had your Kharkiv counteroffensive, you had your Kherson counteroffensive. Kherson counteroffensive was underwhelming for the longest time, causing senseless amounts of casualties. The Kharkiv counteroffensive, however, was quite successful, as Russia had been focusing its forces in the Zaporozhye, Donetsk regions a lot more. They prioritized those regions, and the Russians were forced back from Kharkiv, from their bridgehead in Izium, which were putting pressure on the cities of Slovyansk, Kramatorsk. They had to almost completely abandon the Kharkiv region and retreat back to a line behind the Oskol River, just west of their holdings in Svatova, Luhansk People's Republic, Kremenai, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. And the Russians started to reprioritize and focus on building better defensive positions And it was around this time that Russia ended up um, holding referendums in all the four regions that they currently occupied: Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Luhansk, and they ended up becoming part of Russia. Um, it was also at that point that Vladimir Putin announced partial mobilization, calling up 300,000 reservists of the Russian military, people who um, had previously been in the Russian military not too long ago, like a year to 5 years ago. Um, Around the same time, the head of the Wagner PMC forces, um, Prudashev, I believe his name is, um, started going to Russian prisons and recruiting prisoners to basically fight for the Wagner PMC forces in this conflict. Um, Now, things definitely changed after Russia, or after these regions became annexed by Russia. It changed kind of how the conflict had been fought up until that point. Um, Russia sure had sent a lot of their forces within Ukraine. They were very committed to fighting in Ukraine, but they were not directly commanding what was happening in Ukraine. The DPR and LPR were actually the kind of the spearhead of the operation, and Russia kind of sent their troops for support. They provided more artillery support, air support, intelligence, things of that nature. But Russian command never really took over the entire operation into one cohesive military operation. And that all changed with Russia's annexation of these four regions. What happens now is now Russian military doctrine applies to these regions. Um, it also meant that there was a reshuffling in Russian command. Um, you have a new Russian overall commander, Sergei Valavukin. I'm totally butchering that name. Valavukin. I will get it right next time. I promise, guys. This is more rambly and more free flowing than a lot of my content's going to be. Um, but his story is kind of interesting. He was involved in Syria quite a bit. He was responsible for some of the military operations that took place there. And he was also responsible for, he took charge of the Severodonetsk Lysychansk operation, which was, I think, Russia's greatest success in this war so far. So he definitely ended up being kind of the ideal choice as an overall commander of this operation. What also happened was a special coordination council was created just for this special military operation to make decisions based on kind of the needs of this operation. Martial law has been declared now that these regions are part of Russia, along with some border regions, such as like Belgorod and Kursk as well. And this is to mask Russian military troop movements. And now partial mobilization is in full effect. While at the same time, Ukraine is using this opportunity, while there are relatively few troops in Ukraine facing off against them, to start their counteroffensives now and to do what they need to do now. But of course, with Ukraine's military being so heavily degraded, not to say that the Russians are also not degraded, because they certainly are as well. The Ukrainians have started to get more and more desperate. They've gone for more kind of like infrastructure strikes. They've been responsible for more terrorist attacks, things of that nature, to try to disrupt and to prevent Russia from being able to, accumulate the forces necessary to prevent them from being able to have good logistical support in Ukraine. This was evidenced by like the Kerch bridge attack. This is evidenced by other attacks that took place within Russia. Um, Ukraine started pedal mining Donetsk city, basically shooting mines into the city to start to basically kill civilians, to kind of force kind of discontent within Donetsk city. Um, so this war has certainly escalated quite a bit. Western support has been growing weaker and weaker now. It grew stronger and stronger for quite a long time, but with the economic pressure on a lot of these Western nations, with the energy war that we have been fighting with Russia, with all these sanctions, um, the United States has kind of been struggling with inflation, has been struggling with internal political issues. In Europe is caught in the middle. They're cut off from Russian energy, Russian fertilizer, raw materials. Countries are particularly in trouble are, Great Britain, Germany is in huge trouble. They depended on the pipelines Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, pumping gas from St. Petersburg down to Germany. Those pipelines were blown up about a month ago. No claims for really who did it. Sweden got involved with the investigation, decided to pass it off to Germany because they said that the contents of the investigation were too sensitive. The Germans ended up basically saying that they knew who was responsible for the attacks, but that it would be a threat of national security to reveal those details to the public. Seeing this makes it abundantly clear that it was not Russia who did this. Because if it was Russia who attacked this critical infrastructure to Germany, it would be all over Western media. It would be kind of supporting that narrative that has been going on all this time, which is, Russia's bad, they're doing all these things, they're evil, we need to fight in Ukraine, we need to win this war. Basically, Western media doing everything that they can do to keep popular support for the war going. But as more and more constraints start to be put on the economies of Europe, as winter starts to come, and as these economies struggle to find a replacement for Russian raw materials, they're going to face lower living standards, and they're going to face more and more protests, which have already been ramping up a lot all across Europe, to end the sanctions war against Russia, or to leave the European Union, leave NATO. We've had protests all over France. Basically, workers went on strike. A lot of the nuclear power plants around France weren't operating. There were mass blackouts. A lot of gas stations ran out of gas. There were mass protests basically calling for France to leave the European Union. Britain, there's been quite a political crisis as well. You had Boris Johnson, who was voted out of a vote of no confidence for mismanaging the UK government, and then you had Liz Truss, which was a kamikaze drawn into the British government. She only stayed in office for 44 days before she was voted out, and now we have a new prime minister set to enter. Third one within a year. Germany, in particular, is especially in a bad position. They had a lot of dependence on Russian raw materials for the heavy manufacturing industry. Basically, the entire German machine runs on Russian fuel, and without that, they're going to be facing a very difficult winter. And already we're seeing lots of reports across many European countries that there will need to be a lot of rationing done to make it through winter. And it doesn't look like there's going to be sufficient supplies for everyone to have heating in their homes this winter. Energy bills have been skyrocketing. Businesses have closed down. Um, so this war has been affecting Europe quite badly. The Russian economy itself has been affected by the sanctions, definitely a decent bit. One commodity in particular that's really risen in price has been food. But it appears like everything else has remained relatively stable, and Russia is now actually, their economy is actually growing currently. Um, and Russia has been doing other things as well to adapt to kind of the current circumstances in the war. Um, at the beginning of the war, it was definitely more of a war where Russia was just facing Ukrainian forces with Western support. Now it's a war where Russia's facing a Ukraine military that has been trained by NATO. Um, Thousands and thousands of troops ended up moving into countries like Germany, France, Britain, um, other countries in Europe that that had been a training with NATO standards, receiving direct intelligence from NATO, um, and, uh, and because of that, it's allowed Ukraine to have a lot more tactical successes than they otherwise would have. Um, of course, without NATO, Ukraine would already have been defeated quite a long time ago. But now we're in a place near the end of September. Russia has been continuously on the defensive in pretty much everywhere, except a larger town called Bakhmut, where Russian PMC Wagner forces are there. You have Chechen forces from like the Akhmat Special Battalion there, slowly chipping away at Ukrainian defensives. But overall, things have quieted down quite a bit on the front. Russia has been forced to kind of diversify, modernize their military in ways that they didn't really have to before. They've been purchasing large amounts of Iranian drones. They have been attacking critical energy infrastructure, starting from September throughout even until now. So the focus has definitely shifted. Ukraine has been facing blackouts. Their economy is practically in shambles, and it's hard to say whether Ukraine can even withstand this winter or not. Right now, through the autumn, we've had autumn rains. The ground has been getting soft, and it makes it really difficult for any type of offensive actions to take place, which has certainly contributed to the slow pace of movements on the battlefield itself. But as winter starts to come, snowfall starts to become more frequent, and the ground start to harden. That's when we should expect partial mobilization to be complete. I predict probably right around early November. And this is what a lot of Russian officials are saying too, that next couple weeks, partial mobilization will be completed. Every troop, that we needed, the 300,000 will be deployed, and then offensive actions will be able to take place. So that's just kind of a general rambly overview of kind of how this war has developed since 2014. I'm mentioning all the way back then because this, with Russia's involvement, is really kind of an escalation of that war that already took place. But now we're in a place where the world has almost never been in a higher state of tension, and the risk for this conflict escalating much further to other nations has never been greater. And now Russia, their economy is kind of mobilizing for war. their people are expecting things to escalate more and more, and pretty soon we should start to see the Russian response, and we should finally see the kind of the gloves coming off and a rebranding of the special military operation to probably like a CTO, counter-terrorist operation, at which point everything at Russia's disposal will be able to be used in this conflict, um, including nuclear weapons if things escalate to that, which I really sure hope that they don't. It seems unlikely now, but we'll wait and see. All right, guys. That's all I have to say for now. I know I wasn't generally. There was a lot that I definitely missed. I know that was just kind of. This is kind of more of like a casual discussion, like I said. I just wanted to talk about kind of how things have developed up until now, so that way any videos I produce in the future, you guys can either look back on this. Um, if you're not really that informed on what's been happening up until this point, or look at other resources as well, just to kind of gain an understanding. But I should be talking about things day by day, and we'll see where things go from here. It's certainly very tense, and there's a lot of questions, a lot more questions than there are answers right now. A lot of fog of war. But things seem to be relatively calm right now. It seems there's enough troops in Ukraine for Ukraine to basically not be able to really do many offensive actions, especially since a lot of their power grid is down. It's making it very hard for Ukraine to have the logistical capabilities to transfer troops and equipment around quickly. So we'll see what comes of this, and I'll be releasing more videos soon. All right, thank you guys.